It was the sort of afternoon that seemed suspended in time. The sun dappled through the high elms bordering the grounds of Gossington Hall, casting long shadows across the immaculate lawn. Bees drifted lazily among the foxgloves, and the air was heavy with the mingled scents of fresh-cut grass, warm pastries, and English roses in full bloom. Here, in the heart of St. Edwald's-on-the-Glen, a sleepy village tucked quietly between the South Downs and the forgotten turnings of older maps, the world moved gently, predictably, and without much fuss. Except, of course, when it didn't. The occasion was the annual St. Edwald's Summer Charity Garden Party, a long-standing tradition hosted with genteel pride by Colonel and Mrs. Bantry. Invitations had gone out weeks prior, hand-delivered, on cream-colored cards bearing an elegant script, to benefit the Church Roof Fund, tea and light entertainment, with a special unveiling. The special unveiling was the talk of the village. Earlier that spring, during a half-hearted effort to sort out the contents of Greville Hall's rambling attic, a long-forgotten canvas had come to light, its frame tarnished with dust, but the figure beneath the protective linen oddly vibrant. Lady Agnes Greville had declared, almost instantly, that the subject was Arabella Greville, her great-great-grandmother, a famed society beauty of the late Georgian era. What had turned the village from politely intrigued to breathlessly expectant, however, was a quiet whisper from Julian Hargreaves, an art restorer recently escaped from the chaos of London, the brushwork. It's very like Reynolds. And so it was arranged, the unveiling of what could possibly be a long-lost portrait by Sir Joshua Reynolds. Right in the heart of St. Edwald's, by 3:30, the garden was full to brimming. A modest string quartet from East Downham played beneath the wisteria-draped arbor, their music floating above the general hum of conversation. The colonel, in his old regimental blazer, made his usual rounds with a glass of sherry in hand, grunting amiably. At guests, Mrs. Bantry fussier than ever kept the younger volunteers in a flurry over tablecloths and bunting. Miss Jane Marple sat beneath a parasol near the tea-tent, her knitting needles working with gentle precision. She wore a pale lavender dress, modest and pressed, and a straw hat adorned with cornflowers and a single velvet ribbon. To the untrained, she was no more than a kindly spinster, a fixture of local bake sales and Sunday services, but those who knew her well knew better. "She sees everything," whispered young Daphne Leverton, the vicar's niece, to Mr. Hargreaves as she offered him a cup of elderflower cordial. "Even the things people think they're hiding." "She?" he smiled politely. "The one with the knitting?" "Yes, don't let the wool fool you." Hargreaves chuckled, but did glance, curious, at the elderly lady beneath the parasol. Miss Marple, seemingly oblivious, was watching a pair of children sneak extra scones behind their mother's back. Her eyes twinkled faintly. "Young people always think they're the first to think of things," she said to no one in particular, as she turned her attention to Lady Agnes Greville making her stately approach. Lady Agnes was not a woman to rush. She moved like an icebreaker, deliberate, unmoved, inevitable. She wore navy silk, pearls that spoke of inheritance rather than indulgence, and a frown of such grandeur it may well have been embroidered into the family crest. 2 steps behind her hovered her lady's maid, Miss Crampton, a wiry, pale creature whose life seemed built around the careful handling of Lady Agnes's opinions. Lady Agnes took her place beside the burgundy-draped easel beneath the marquee, where a small lectern had been set for the occasion. She cleared her throat once, as though announcing not herself, but tradition itself. "Thank you all for coming," she began, her voice cool and imperious. "This is not only a matter of village pride, but one of family legacy. Arabella Greville, whose portrait we shall now unveil, was a woman of grace, courage, and singular beauty. Her memory, I believe, deserves such a moment." There was polite applause. Some leaned forward, others adjusted their hats for a better view. The quartet ceased playing. The air seemed to still. Lady Agnes lifted the crimson cord, glanced at the crowd with the faintest flicker of satisfaction, and gave it a ceremonious pull. Nothing happened. There was a pause. She tugged again, this time with more authority. Still nothing. A murmur began at the back of the marquee. Colonel Bantry, startled from a conversation with the vicar, hurried to assist. Let me just, there we go. With a screech of metal and the flutter of velvet, the cloth finally slipped free. The easel was empty. A sharp, collective breath rippled through the onlookers. Mrs. Bantry gave a high-pitched yelp, nearly dropping her teacup. Miss Hartnell clutched the Reverend's sleeve. Lady Agnes stood absolutely still, her gloved hands clenched white around the lectern. The easel's supporting arms were perfectly intact. A pale rectangle remained where dust had been recently disturbed. But the canvas itself, the famed Greville portrait, was gone. It must be a mistake, Mrs. Bantry said, glancing around helplessly. Perhaps it fell? Or perhaps, Lady Agnes said coldly, it was taken. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. Her words struck the gathered guests like a slap. Taken? Cried Miss Hartnell. But who would dare? People dare a great deal when they believe no one is looking, said Lady Agnes, her eyes sweeping the crowd like a searchlight. She turned abruptly toward Miss Crampton. It was there this morning. I saw it myself after breakfast, in the drawing-room, before we had it brought here. I supervised the placement. Myself, madam, Crampton replied quickly, though a nervous tremor edged her voice. At 1:45, Mr. Hargreaves oversaw the adjustment of the frame. All eyes turned to the art restorer, who looked rather stunned by the sudden attention. Well, yes, he said slowly, the frame was in good condition. I recall checking the latches. The portrait was definitely mounted on the easel, perhaps 2 hours ago, just before guests began arriving. So it disappeared in plain sight, murmured Miss Marple, her needles still clicking. Mrs. Bantry blinked. But who would steal a painting during a tea party? Someone very bold, the Reverend said solemnly. Or very foolish. Or neither, Miss Marple added softly. Sometimes a theft is not really about the thing stolen at all. She said no more, but her pale blue eyes lingered on the vacant easel for a moment longer than most. Around her, the party dissolved into a hive of agitated speculation. The colonel had begun directing the groundskeeper to search the perimeter. Lady Agnes, white with fury, issued instructions to Crampton with the clipped efficiency of a field. Marshall, Mr. Hargreaves, was cornered by 3 guests, pressing him on the value of the portrait. Children were ushered back to their parents. The tea tent, once filled with easy laughter, now murmured with alarm. And in the center of it all, as the summer sun hung high over the shaken village, a portrait had vanished, silent, sudden, impossible. Miss Marple folded her knitting quietly and placed it in her lap. A very curious business, she said again. Then, almost to herself, yes, very curious indeed. By evening the village of St. Edward's on the Glen was humming with more speculation than it had known in decades. Teacups clattered, whispered suspicions flowed more freely than the sherry at the fete, and a single topic possessed every parlor and garden bench from Ivy Lane to Church View. The portrait had vanished. That phrase in its various dramatic permutations, stolen in broad daylight, spirited away like magic, just up and gone, echoed from house to house, accompanied by widening eyes and knowing nods. Someone must have seen something. Someone always did. At the Greville Arms, the village's only inn and unofficial headquarters for unfiltered opinion, the usual gathering of pensioners and pipe smokers abandoned their talk of cricket scores in favor of juicier fare. Wasn't locked, that marquee, said Mr. Vane, who claimed with little proof that he once did light security for a minor peer. Anyone could have ducked in, walked off with the thing under a sheet. Walked off? It's near 3 feet tall, scoffed Mrs. Prout, the butcher's sister. Not exactly something you stuff in a handbag, is it? Well, then it must have been an inside job, muttered Dennis Golding, landlord of the Arms, who had a gift for declaring whatever most aligned with the consensus. The help, if you ask me, one of the staff. Oh, no, said Mrs. Prout, lowering her voice. They're all local girls this year. My niece is among them. She said Lady Agnes locked the portrait in the drawing-room herself till just before the event. Then what about that London fellow? Mr. Vane put in, stabbing his pipe in the air. The one fiddling with the frame. What's he doing in the village, eh? Says he's a restorer, but that's a funny job for someone who looks like he belongs in a jazz club. They all chuckled darkly, then returned to their drinks with theatrical suspicion. At the same hour, over on the crescent, two ladies, in their late 60s, sat by a crackling fire with the curtains drawn tight against the dusk. The room smelled of lemon polish and pressed linen, and the tension between them hovered like steam. "I think it's dreadful," said Mrs. Amelia Hardcastle, the vicar's wife, folding her hands in her lap. "I don't mind saying I was. Never fond of that painting. It looks so knowing, don't you think? But to take it from under Lady Agnes's nose, bold as brass. Across from her, Miss Marple sat with a cup of cocoa, her posture relaxed but alert. The firelight danced gently over her neat gray curls and the soft wool of her cardigan. "Boldness," she said mildly, "is often mistaken for confidence. But sometimes, Amelia, it is desperation in a tidy frock." Mrs. Hardcastle blinked. "Good heavens, Jane, you think it was one of us?" "Someone from the fate?" Miss Marple gave the smallest shrug. "Only that such events draw a crowd, not all of them regular villagers. And you'd be surprised what people are willing to do when they think something perhaps their pride, their future, even their sense of self is at stake." There was a brief silence before Amelia whispered, "Do you think it could have been Gerald?" Miss Marple sipped her cocoa, not answering at once. Gerald Greville, Lady Agnes's only son, had hovered around the edges of the party that afternoon, with a restless energy, pacing the garden and disappearing into the house more than once. Handsome in a drawn, slightly brittle way, Gerald had long been the subject of quiet concern. Rumor had it he gambled heavily in London before being called back to the family estate ostensibly to manage the books, though no one really believed he managed anything. "He did seem rather preoccupied," Miss Marple said finally. "But then again, many men look guilty when they are simply anxious." "Anxious about what?" "Well," Miss Marple murmured, "perhaps that's the real question." Elsewhere that same evening, in a room lined with faded ancestral portraits of heavy-lidded Grevilles in powdered wigs, Lady Agnes sat bolt upright at a writing desk, her gloved hands clenched around a pen she had not used in several minutes. Opposite her stood Inspector Raymond Cray, newly appointed to the district. He had kind eyes and an impatient mouth. "I assure you, Lady Agnes, the matter is being taken seriously. But if I may say so, a canvas is not a body. You've been quite firm in requesting this be treated as a criminal theft, because it was a theft," Lady Agnes said icily. "Arabella's portrait has hung in this house for over a century. It did not vanish by accident." Cray nodded, making a note in his pad. "Anyone besides Mr. Hargreaves handle it today?" "Only Crampton, my maid. She supervised the easel's preparation. She's utterly dependable." "And your son, Gerald?" Lady Agnes's tone changed subtly cool to frozen. "My son would not steal from his own house." Cray looked up. "I understand, madam. But several witnesses saw him in and out of the marquee before the unveiling." Lady Agnes gave him a hard look, then gestured vaguely toward the window. "If you wish to waste time chasing shadows, Inspector, do so. But I recommend you begin with people who had something to gain." Cray paused, pen still in hand. "Like money?" She arched one perfect brow. "Or revenge," she said. Later that night, as the village quieted and the hum of scandal gave way to the hush of drawn curtains and ticking clocks, Miss Marple stood by her window in the guest bedroom of her cottage, brushing a few crumbs of lavender biscuit from the sill. She had laid aside her knitting, but her thoughts were busy turning over the day like an old coin. Something about the moment of the unveiling did not sit quite right. Not just the timing of the theft, which was peculiar enough, but the expressions, the stillness that fell too sharply. The way Gerald had vanished just after the discovery and had not returned, not even when the police arrived. She turned toward the table and picked up the fate program, flipping through its neatly printed pages. Tea cake judging, raffle draw, portrait unveiling, live music. Then her eyes caught on a name, Julian Hargreaves, listed not just as Art Restorer London, but as the speaker for the brief lecture preceding the unveiling. A lecture that had never happened, because the portrait had disappeared. But why hadn't he insisted on speaking? Most men like to talk about their own expertise, especially if fame and attribution were involved. Unless he'd known it wouldn't be there, or feared being seen beside it. Miss Marple gently tapped her chin with the folded program. There was something else, something small, a thread, she was certain, barely visible. And someone, somewhere, was trying very hard to make. Sure, it stayed hidden. Outside, the church bell rang midnight. Miss Marple turned away from the window and extinguished the lamp. The morning after the garden fete dawned crisp and clear, as if nature itself meant to sweep away the confusion of the previous day. But no amount of sunshine could quiet the undercurrent of curiosity rippling through the village. The news had already spread, as news does in small English communities, swiftly, thoroughly, and with a flair for embellishment. By 9 o'clock, grocers and postmistresses, milkmen and schoolboys had all heard some version of the theft. A few variations included a masked intruder, one featured a daring hot air escape, and more than one suggested the portrait was cursed and had vanished of its own accord. Miss Marple, as was her custom on Thursdays, arrived at the Greville Hall. Gates with a small bouquet of marigolds and a loaf of walnut bread tucked under her arm. She had promised them to Mrs. Weatherby, Lady Agnes's cook, who had mentioned the garden marigolds made excellent dye for eggs, and that her sister-in-law had a fondness for the walnut loaf. As she was ushered into the stone vestibule by a subdued Crampton, Miss Marple took in the house's atmosphere with quiet attentiveness. Greville Hall had always struck her as the sort of house that disapproved of change. Its paneled walls, ancestral oil portraits, and heavy brocade curtains gave it a sense of suspended time, but today it felt brittle. The air had that taut, brittle stillness of a place where something important had gone missing, and not just a painting. Crampton showed her into a small parlor off the east corridor. "Lady Agnes will join you shortly, Miss Marple. She's speaking with the inspector again." Miss Marple nodded, then smiled kindly at the maid. "You must be run off your feet?" "Crampton," the woman gave a weary nod. "It's been rather a morning, miss." She hesitated a beat too long before leaving the room. Miss Marple noted it, as she noted the faint impression on one of the two armchairs opposite, the faintest indent of someone having recently sat down, though no tea had been brought. Curious, the room itself was lined with cabinets filled with curios, pressed botanical samples, shells, some silver trinkets, and what appeared to be a set of Georgian snuff boxes behind glass. One shelf was missing a box. Miss Marple thought nothing of it at first. But as she stood, examining the collection more closely, her brows drew together ever so slightly. The snuff boxes were arranged meticulously, by era and finish. The absent one left a clean rectangular void amid the otherwise tidy display. She had just turned back to her seat when the door opened and in swept Lady Agnes Greville. "Miss Marple," she said, with her usual crispness, "I do apologize for the delay. I'm besieged. And now the inspector insists on questioning the staff again, though it's clear they know nothing." "I quite understand," Miss Marple said mildly. "It's a trying time. You've always kept a proper house, that's evident." "Lady," Agnes exhaled. Not a sigh, she would never stoop to anything so plebeian, but something between weariness and impatience. "I cannot abide inefficiency," she said. "And I refuse to entertain the idea that someone under my roof would do such a thing." "Then you believe the thief came from outside the fete?" Miss Marple asked gently. "I haven't the faintest idea," Lady Agnes admitted, pacing once toward the fireplace. "But I know my staff. Crampton has been with me nearly 30 years. I raised Gerald to understand the responsibilities of this estate, however much that may have frayed in recent years." Miss Marple let the silence linger, watching the older woman's composed face with gentle scrutiny. Lady Agnes was not a woman prone to emotional collapse, but even marble statues crack under pressure. "I do wonder," Miss Marple said after a moment, "whether the portrait had particular value to someone not simply for its artist, but for its subject." Lady Agnes turned sharply. "Arabella Greville?" Miss Marple inclined her head. "I recall reading that she left the estate under some scandal." "An elopement, wasn't it?" Lady Agnes gave a tight nod. "A foolish business." She ran off with a man well beneath her, no title, no land. The painting was hidden away afterward. My late husband refused to display it. And yet it re-emerged for the fete, Miss Marple said softly. That, Lady Agnes admitted, was Gerald's idea. He's convinced that the painting is authentic Reynolds. Said it could bring in attention, perhaps even financial relief, if appraised properly, but I had my doubts. May I ask, Miss Marple said, eyes glinting kindly, where Mr. Gerald is this morning? Lady Agnes paused. He left shortly after the fete. Went up to London, or so he claims. I haven't spoken with him. He left a note. Did he seem upset? More agitated than usual, perhaps? Gerald is unpredictable. But stealing? From his own family? No, even he would not stoop that far. Miss Marple gave a faint smile and stood. Thank you for your time, Lady Agnes. I don't suppose I could pop into the drawing-room before I go. I left my parasol there yesterday in the commotion. Lady Agnes waved a hand. Of course. Though you'll find the room in disarray. The police have had it for hours. Miss Marple walked slowly down the hall, her footsteps muffled on. The thick runner. The drawing-room stood at the front of the house, its bay windows overlooking the rose garden. It smelled faintly of old varnish and disturbed dust. The easel still stood in the center of the room, flanked by 2 velvet ropes. It looked oddly forlorn now, as if bereft of its purpose, but Miss Marple wasn't looking at the easel. She stepped to the side table near the fireplace, where several champagne flutes from the fete had been stacked for removal. She noted one in particular smudged, half-full, forgotten behind a curtain. Miss Marple bent, examining the edge of the rug nearby. A faint dent, very faint, almost mist-marked where a chair or stool might once have rested. She straightened. Slowly, the theft, she thought, had not been frantic. It had been careful, deliberate. Whoever had done it had taken time, just enough. As she stepped back into the hallway, she nearly collided with Julian Hargreaves, who looked flushed and distracted. Miss Marple, he said, slightly startled. I didn't expect to see you here. I left my parasol, she said, smiling. You're back at the hall this morning? Oh, yes, Lady Agnes asked me to assist with cataloguing some of the other pieces in light of, well, you know. He adjusted his satchel. Frankly, I'd rather not be here. Feels a bit haunted now, doesn't it? Miss Marple regarded him gently. Guilt often lends a place a ghostly quality, Mr. Hargreaves. He blinked. I beg your pardon? Oh, I didn't mean you, she said lightly. Merely. That places remember things. And people remember more than they let on. She patted his arm kindly and left him standing there, blinking after her. As she stepped back into the sunlight and down the gravel path, her thoughts swirled gently. A missing portrait, a family with too many silences, a restorer who had not restored. A chair moved, a drink left unfinished, a snuff box removed. Little things, scattered and unimportant until one begins to fit them together. And Miss Marple, as always, was very good at jigsaws. Inspector Raymond Cray stared at the notes in his notebook with a furrowed brow. He was seated in the corner of the village police station, a squat brick building wedged between the greengrocer's and the old chapel. The scent of oiled wood and weak tea clung to the air. It was his third interview of the morning, and the name Julian Hargreaves had come up more times than he liked. Not directly, of course, but subtly. In the sideways glances, the hesitations, the carefully worded phrases. Well, of course he's not from around here. Or funny, him arriving just before the fete. Or the kind of man who reads too much and listens too little. And then there was Gerald Greville. The son's sudden departure had unsettled more than just his mother. According to the groundskeeper, Gerald had argued with Lady Agnes 2 days before the fete. According to Crampton, he had disappeared into the house multiple times the day of the theft. And according to Gerald himself, well, there was no according to. Gerald hadn't been reachable since leaving for London. Cray closed his notebook and sighed. Miss Marple had been right to speak cautiously, he thought. In some villages, crimes bloomed like mushrooms, quietly in the dark, feeding on secrets. But in St. Edwold's, the rot ran quietly beneath perfectly trimmed hedges and polite nods. He would start with the London man. Julian Hargreaves sat in the Greville Arms front parlor, drumming his fingers along the edge of his teacup. The floral china looked absurd in his hands, elegant and far too fragile. He was a long-limbed man, prematurely gray at the temples, with an elegant tiredness about him, as though he'd been exiled from some smarter world and hadn't yet adapted to the slowness of village life. The inspector's voice was neutral but firm. "You say you last saw the portrait 2 hours before the unveiling?" "Yes," Hargreaves said, not looking up. "Roughly that?" "I oversaw the frame's positioning, examined the easel, adjusted the cord so the cloth would fall evenly. There was nothing unusual." "No movement in the marquee after that?" "Not that I saw." "You were outside?" "Circulating, being useful." He gave a hollow laugh. "Trying to avoid Lady Agnes's disdain. I get the impression she didn't care for the idea that I might be right, that the portrait really was a Reynolds. And if it were, then it would be worth a small fortune. Even a minor work by Reynolds is 6 figures. Cray paused. "And you knew this?" Hargreaves gave him a long look. "I specialize in restoration of late 18th century British works, yes." I knew this. I also knew that if my assessment were validated, it might bring attention. Possibly funding, a few museum inquiries. But no, before you ask, I didn't steal it. "No one said you did," Cray replied mildly. "No, but they're all thinking it, aren't they?" Cray closed his notebook. "Where were you between 2 o'clock and 3:30, Mr. Hargreaves?" "In the garden, near the bandstand for a while. I spoke with Miss Hartnell. Then I had a conversation with the vicar's niece by the rose arbor. And I went briefly into the drawing room to find a cloth to adjust the glare on the easel glass." Cray raised an eyebrow. "The drawing room?" "Yes, the one next to the conservatory." The maid saw me enter. I was there for no more than a minute. That, Cray thought, was more than enough time. At that very moment, in her cottage by the churchyard, Miss Marple was watering her primroses and considering motives. She had learned long ago that people did not always steal for gain. Sometimes they stole to hide something, a secret, a shame, a connection. And sometimes they stole simply because they believed no one would ever think they could. She had written a short note that morning, folded it twice, and sent it round to the vicarage with young Timmy Bell, who enjoyed being useful and had no notion of discretion. The note had read, "Amelia dear, would you kindly ask Miss Daphne if—" She recalls precisely where she was standing when she spoke with Mr. Hargreaves at the fete. Important for the roses, of course. "Yours affectionately, J.M." By mid-afternoon, the answer arrived, delivered by Timmy with grass on his knees and a proud grin. Near the arbor, but he was distracted. Kept glancing at the hall, seemed nervous. Said he needed to check something indoors. Miss Marple folded the note and tucked it into her recipe book. One small inconsistency, she thought, did not make a crime. But it certainly could make a pattern. Later that day, as the sun dipped low over the village green, Inspector Cray paid a visit to Greville Hall not to speak with Lady Agnes, but to find Crampton. The maid met him in the front hall, her hands trembling slightly. "I don't know what more I can say, sir," she said. "I saw the portrait placed on the easel. I watched Mr. Hargreaves examine it. After that I went to the kitchen. Were you alone in the drawing room at any point?" "No, sir, never, not for more than a moment." "But you did see Mr. Gerald Greville there that afternoon?" Crampton hesitated. "Yes, briefly. He seemed agitated. Muttered something about being right all along. I thought he meant the painting's value." Cray frowned. "Anything else?" She looked down at her apron. "Well, I did see someone come in the back entrance around 2:30. Thought it odd. Most guests were out on the lawn." "Who?" "I couldn't tell. Just a flash of green. A woman's dress. I think tall, fast on her feet." Cray made a note. "Lady Agnes has such a dress, doesn't she?" "Oh, no, sir," Crampton said quickly. "Lady Agnes never wears green. Thinks it unlucky." Unlucky indeed, Cray thought grimly. That evening Miss Marple attended the Women's Institute meeting where the ladies were discussing the success of the fete, though every conversation circled inevitably back to the missing portrait. "I still say it's the son," declared Miss Hartnell, fanning herself. "Poor boy's always been one wrong turn from ruin. Gambling, drinking, that unfortunate episode with the tobacconist's daughter, allegedly," corrected Mrs. Bantry. "Well, yes, but still." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "I once knew a young man in St. Mary Mead who was thought to have stolen a watch from his uncle's bureau. Everyone believed it until it turned out he'd simply moved it to the bread bin for safekeeping during a storm." There was a pause. "In the bread bin, Jane?" asked Mrs. Bantry, bewildered. "Yes," Miss Marple said cheerfully. "He was never very logical, but he was devoted to keeping things dry." Laughter broke the tension. But inside, Miss Marple was thinking about bread bins, and boys with poor reputations, and women in green dresses who moved swiftly and were not always noticed. Gerald Greville's absence gnawed at her. Too convenient, too expected. And what? Of Crampton, so loyal, so efficient, and yet so vague about small things? She had nearly all her suspects now. A son with motive and opportunity, a stranger with expertise, a housemaid who saw too much, perhaps even a visitor who wasn't invited at all. But she needed more. One thing was certain, this was no ordinary theft. Someone had wanted that painting gone before it was seen. That suggested not greed, but fear. And fear, Miss Marple knew, had a distinctive shape. The morning fog clung low over the hedgerows as Miss Marple made her way up the gravel path to Greville Hall for the second time that week. It was still too early for calls, by most standards, but Jane Marple had learned that the best clues revealed themselves before the day's polish and pretense could be properly applied. She had written, politely and precisely, to Lady Agnes the evening prior, requesting a brief viewing of the portrait's former location. Her reason was carefully couched in the language of sympathy, simply to satisfy a lingering curiosity. "Dear Lady Agnes, and to give peace to a mind always concerned with orderly rooms." The reply had come promptly. Lady Agnes had granted her 5 minutes. 5 minutes. "No more, Miss Marple. I do hope you understand." Crampton received her at the door with pursed lips and a faint tremble of her left hand. It did not escape Miss Marple's notice that the usually rigid maid had misplaced one of her hairpins. "Right this way, ma'am," she murmured, guiding her toward the drawing-room. The space was exactly as Miss Marple remembered it. High ceilings, the faint scent of lemon beeswax, and that odd air of suspended activity that lingered in rooms where important things had recently occurred. The easel remained in place, flanked now by small placards marked "Police Evidence, Do Not Move." Miss Marple glanced at them but did not touch. Instead, she paced slowly around the perimeter of the room, her eyes moving with gentle precision from skirting boards to sills, from draperies to dusty corners. "Lady Agnes asks that nothing be disturbed," Crampton added, hovering near the threshold. "I wouldn't dream of it," Miss Marple said kindly. Her eyes flicked to a narrow console table tucked against the far wall. Upon it were an arrangement of dried hydrangeas and, most curiously, a small spill of Deborah neatly gathered, yet not entirely erased. She approached it with a subtle interest. "Dust?" she asked. Crampton stepped forward. "The officers asked to examine it, some fragments of something. Perhaps from the easel?" Miss Marple leaned slightly, examining the tiny pile of gray-brown flecks. "Dust, yes, but not ordinary dust." Mixed within were tiny chips of what appeared to be dried paint ultramarine, ochre, and an unusual greenish-blue colors not common to modern household finishes. "May I ask?" Miss Marple said, her voice light. "Has anyone dusted this table since the fete?" "No, ma'am." "On orders of the inspector?" "Quite right." Miss Marple's eyes flicked again, this time to the rugged Grand Persian runner that led across the center of the room. Something near its edge caught her attention. A faint outline where a small item had once rested, perhaps a pedestal? Or more. Likely a small footstool? She bent slightly as if to examine a speck on her shoe and took a better look. The outline was neat. Unmoved for some time, then recently displaced. She straightened. "Thank you, Crampton." I believe I've satisfied my curiosity." As she turned to leave, Crampton hesitated. "Miss Marple, if I may ask, do you believe the painting was stolen because of who it showed?" Miss Marple looked at her steadily. "Why would you think that, my dear?" Crampton's hands twisted at the edges of her apron. "Just something I overheard." "From Mr. Gerald? He was speaking with someone on the telephone the night before the fete. Said, 'If that portrait is what I think it is, it changes everything.' Then he said something about the name at the bottom." "The signature?" "No, ma'am. Not the artist's name. The subject's Arabella, but he called her something else. Arabella Fairfax, I think it was." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed very slightly. "I see," she murmured. "Thank you, Crampton. That's very helpful." By early afternoon, Miss Marple was at the local library, an unassuming stone building on the edge of the green, its shelves full of forgotten genealogies and handwritten local histories. The librarian, a precise woman named Miss Hewer, greeted her with a startled smile. "Miss Marple! How very rare to see you in our nonfiction section." "Oh, I always enjoy the dustier corners," Miss Marple replied. "I was hoping you might have some of the old parish archives. Births, marriages, family registries, around 1790 to 1820. Miss Hewer blinked. "Of course. They're in the back index drawers." Within the hour, Miss Marple had unearthed a register from 1796. The writing was faded. Penned in looping black script, she ran her finger down the column until she found it. Arabella Fairfax, born 1773, baptized at St. Thomas's Parish. Daughter of Jonathan Fairfax, local land steward. No mother listed. Next to her name, in a later hand, was a small notation. Married, Greville Thomas, 1792. See notes. Miss Marple turned the page. Notes. Controversial union. Fairfax of modest standing. Child born within 7 months. Disowned by Greville. Family until 1810, when portrait commission likely in reconciliation. She sat very still. Arabella was not born at Greville. She had married into the family, and she had done so under a cloud of disapproval. The Grevilles had covered it up, but someone had left the truth in ink, buried in the back of a forgotten book. And now, that portrait painted perhaps at the moment of the family's reluctant acceptance had disappeared. Why? Because someone didn't want the truth seen? Or because someone had only just realized what the portrait revealed? That evening, over a quiet supper of stew and bread at Mrs. Bantry's, Miss Marple spoke little. She stirred her food thoughtfully, her mind elsewhere. "Jane," Mrs. Bantry said gently, "you've not said 2 words since you sat down. That poor girl in the grocer's thought you looked positively haunted." "I was thinking of something." "Curious," Miss Marple said. "Do you recall the artist's signature on the portrait?" "I can't say I looked closely," Mrs. Bantry admitted. "I was too busy wondering how Lady Agnes managed to keep those hydrangeas so blue." "I remember it," Miss Marple murmured. "But now I wonder, was there only the signature?" Mrs. Bantry blinked. "What do you mean?" "Some painters added names to their subjects, a small plaque, or even an inscription. Do you think it said something revealing?" "I think," Miss Marple said slowly, "that someone may have known the portrait would expose a truth they preferred buried. That perhaps Arabella Fairfax, however she came to be a Greville, represented something inconvenient to someone's version of the past." Mrs. Bantry's eyes widened. "Oh, aye. And I think," Miss Marple added, "that the clue lies not just in what was taken, but in what remains." Back in her sitting room that night, Miss Marple took out her knitting and settled by the window. She watched the gas lamps flicker across the lane, her fingers moving gently with the needles, a smear of paint, a moved stool, a forgotten surname. It was all there, if one looked not with suspicion, but with understanding. People were not puzzles, they were patterns. And patterns, when studied patiently, told the truth. Someone had feared exposure. Someone had acted to prevent it. And, someone else, Miss Marple suspected, had seen more than they had admitted. It was time, she thought, to stir the waters a little. The picture might be missing, but the people were not. And people, Miss Marple knew, always gave themselves away. In the days that followed the inquest's quiet verdict, death by poisoning, 'cause undetermined, the mood in Little Wychford took on an uneasy stiffness, as if the entire village had stepped into shoes a size too small. People smiled more broadly than necessary. They walked faster past neighbors' hedges, and they whispered in lower voices, though no less frequently. At the Greville estate, the drapes remained drawn more often than not, and Lady Agnes took her meals alone. Several engagements, lunches, teas, even the charity whist drive were cancelled with polite regrets. The air around Fernwood was thick with silence, and within it something else, not grief, precisely, but fear or guilt. Miss Marple did not press. She moved, as she often did, quietly and precisely through the lives around her. A small question here, a gentle observation there. It was, she believed, in the nature of human beings to speak most when they believed themselves unheard. So it was that she found herself once again at the vicarage having tea with Amelia Hardcastle, who, as ever, possessed more opinions than inhibitions. "I don't care what the coroner says," Amelia declared, pouring a healthy measure of cream into her cup. "People do not simply collapse after a half-glass of elderflower wine unless something's been slipped into it." "And who was serving?" "The wine, I ask you? Lionel Simmons?" "A man whose hands have always struck me as far too smooth for someone claiming to be a carpenter." "Lionel Simmons," Miss Marple said mildly, "was also the one who found Gerald's cravat pin at the fete, was he not?" Amelia blinked. Yes, he said it had dropped behind a rose bush. Funny thing, though, Gerald hadn't been anywhere near the rose beds that afternoon. He was helping at the auction tent. "Curious," Miss Marple murmured. "And there's more," Amelia continued, leaning forward. "I heard well from Edith Larch, actually, that Gerald had some kind of argument with Lady Agnes the morning of the fete, something about his inheritance. She was seen leaving his study looking quite pale." "That's interesting," said Miss Marple. "I do wonder whether that's why he made a call to his solicitor the evening before. You know, I happened to pass the post office that morning and saw young Tommy Brent carrying a telegram marked, 'For London, rather urgent, I believe.'" Amelia's mouth dropped open. "Do you suppose he was trying to change his will?" "That would be speculation," Miss Marple said gently, "but the timing is suggestive." The same afternoon, the village square bustled in a peculiar way, as if trying to outpace its own sense of foreboding. Mrs. Larch presided over the grocer's counter with a renewed severity, and the talk turned, as it always did, back to the portrait. "They say it was valuable," muttered old Mr. Chivers, sipping his barley water on the bench. "Not in coin, but in meaning, old family shame, hidden away in oils." "But who would take it?" asked Mary Pratt, the schoolmistress. "Surely not Lady Agnes. She adored the thing." "Perhaps too much," Chivers replied. "Perhaps she didn't want it seen too closely." "Rubbish," sniffed Mrs. Larch. "She couldn't carry it out herself, could she? And who else would want a portrait of some dead Greville lady unless it showed something worth hiding?" There was a pause. Miss Marple, who stood behind a rack of lavender-scented soaps, did not interject, but her eyes moved slowly over the assembled faces, noting who looked defensive, who seemed too still, and who kept looking at the ground. That evening, Lady Agnes Greville finally agreed to see Miss Marple. They sat in the morning room, where the chintz was faded and the clock ticked with stubborn regularity. Agnes was pale but composed, her hands folded precisely in her lap. "I cannot speak long," she said. "The doctor insists on rest." "Of course, dear Lady Agnes," Miss Marple replied. "I only wanted to inquire about the portrait. Not to intrude, but I heard from someone that Gerald had called it by another name, Arabella Fairfax." Agnes's expression shifted, not in surprise, but in resignation. "Yes," she said quietly. "That was her maiden name. The family buried it long ago." "Gerald?" He had become interested in genealogy. He said the portrait's inscription confirmed a theory he had. "What theory?" Agnes hesitated. "That Arabella was not merely a family scandal? That she may not have been married to Thomas Greville when she bore his child." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "That would change the line of descent and inheritance." "Yes." Agnes closed her eyes briefly. Gerald was the last male heir. If Arabella's child was illegitimate, the entail would have defaulted. He would have inherited nothing. Fernwood would have passed elsewhere. To you? Agnes gave a dry laugh. I already had Fernwood. But if Gerald lost claim, I suppose the next in line might be a distant cousin. I wouldn't know where to begin. Miss Marple smiled gently. Perhaps Gerald was beginning to trace that very line. Later, on the walk home, Miss Marple paused outside the Simmons workshop. A faint smell of turpentine and linseed oil drifted on the air. She peered in through the slightly ajar door. Inside, Lionel Simmons stood over a half-stripped canvas. He looked up quickly. Miss Marple, my apologies, she said. I didn't mean to startle you. I was only curious. That painting is it being restored? He hesitated. Yes, just a commission. Nothing important. Odd, said Miss Marple. The color sea green, is it? Reminds me of the old portrait. The one that's missing? Lionel's eyes flickered. Coincidence, I suppose, she smiled. Perhaps? I've always found, Mr. Simmons, that coincidences in small villages tend to be more crowded than elsewhere. That same night, Miss Marple sat by the fire, reflecting on her findings. There were cracks forming, not just in the paint, but in the people. Gerald had discovered something in that portrait. Something tied not only to history, but to money, pride, and power. He had confided in no one, or had he? Someone had acted swiftly before the fate, before the unveiling, before the scandal could grow roots. A signature, a surname, a pregnancy nearly forgotten, and a family portrait that might just prove everything. But someone else had seen the danger, and someone had taken steps to erase it. Miss Marple folded her knitting into her lap and rang. The bell, it was time, she thought, to stir the embers, and see who began to burn. The summer dusk fell earlier than usual over Little Wychford, casting long, uncertain shadows across the green. Beneath the polished civility of village life, tension was slowly knotting like thread pulled too tight. The inquest had closed without answers, but the questions remained, lingering like the taste of something left unsaid. At the Red Hart Inn, where many villagers retreated for evening solace and shared murmurs, something unexpected interrupted the idle chatter. Just after 8 o'clock, the pub's side door opened with a gust of cool air, and in stepped a man few had seen in years. Peter Holland, once the Greville's land agent, now a stranger with a lined face and hard eyes. Old Mr. Chivers squinted. By heaven, that's him. Back from Devon, is he? Behind the bar, landlord Fred Cooper dried a glass and leaned toward his regulars. Thought he ran off after that business with the accounts. Wasn't proven, murmured Mrs. Larch, though the Grevilles dismissed him quietly enough. No fanfare, no farewell. Something fishy, I always said. Peter, clearly aware of the eyes on him, nodded curtly and took a seat near the fireplace. His appearance, greased coat, leather satchel, and faint smudge of ink on one thumb suggested business, not sentiment. And that, precisely, was what worried Miss Marple when she heard of it the next morning. It was Mrs. Cooper who brought her the news over a basket of gooseberries. He's staying at the inn, she said. Booked a room for 3 nights. Sighed, he came to settle old matters. That was the phrase he used, settling old matters. Miss Marple offered her customary smile and a polite murmur of interest. But her mind was already working. Holland's sudden return, just days after Gerald Greville's death and the portrait's disappearance, could not be coincidence. Not here, not now. She made her way to the inn that afternoon under the pretext of visiting Fred about raffle donations for the church roof. Once business was dispensed with, she lingered at the bar long enough to see Holland come down the stairs, coat folded over his arm and a leather folio clutched in hand. He paused when he saw her. Miss Marple, he said with a stiff nod. How curious, she said gently, that you should return just now. He studied her face. I heard about Gerald. Tragic. Yes, and yet, she added mildly. Some might wonder how the news reached you so swiftly, given your departure years ago was unceremonious. He gave her a half-smile, wry and tired. Bad bookkeeping and worse gossip. I wasn't stealing. Just juggling figures to make ends meet, Gerald knew. He let me go quietly to avoid scandal. Miss Marple tilted her head. That was generous of him. He was a better man than he let on, Peter said, voice tight. He wrote to me last month, asked for old estate records. Sighed, he needed proof of something to do with the Greville line inheritance. Law, if I recall. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed, though her smile remained. Did you send them? Peter opened his folio and drew out a folded letter, yellowed slightly at the edges. No, I brought them. I intended to speak to him directly at the fete. When I arrived and heard what had happened. I see, she said, but she didn't, not yet. That same evening, another visitor returned to Fernwood Hall, a Miss Rowena Leach, Gerald's former fiancée. Though their engagement had ended nearly 2 years before under vague circumstances, her reappearance drew immediate attention. She's staying with the vicar's cousin in Heathfield, Mrs. Larch whispered to no fewer than 6 people by. Mid-morning. Came under the pretext of visiting the church gardens, but I know what a purposeful stride looks like. Miss Marple, as it happened, had already invited Rowena to tea. She found the younger woman 32, quietly elegant, with a stiff collar and untouchable posture remarkably self-contained. I didn't come for the funeral, Rowena said after a sip of Darjeeling. That would have been awkward. But Gerald and I spoke briefly 2 weeks ago. He said he was uncovering something important. Something about his mother's family. He thought it might change everything. Did he say what, exactly? Rowena hesitated. Only that it had to do with the portrait. The woman in it, Arabella Fairfax. He said the name had been altered on old documents, painted over even, that someone had deliberately hidden her identity. Miss Marple's eyes brightened slightly. Arabella, Rowena continued, was not a noblewoman as the family pretended. She was an artist's model, likely unwed, and possibly of foreign descent, Italian or Portuguese, a scandal in those days. Gerald believed that the Grevilles married her in secret to save face, and if they didn't, then Fernwood passes to another branch. Gerald said he needed to verify something before confronting his mother. There was a silence. And now, Rowena added bitterly, he's dead, and that portrait is gone. It was just past twilight when Miss Marple paid her second visit that week to the Simmons workshop. This time she brought a small cake. How thoughtful, Lionel said awkwardly, wiping his hands on a rag. Miss Marple set the cake down and turned to the canvas still perched on his easel. It was almost finished now. The brushwork was excellent, but the likeness was unmistakable. Arabella, her eyes bold and storm-shadowed against a seascape background of uncanny green. Fascinating, Miss Marple said. It really is her, Lionel swallowed. It's just a commission. You said that last time. But now I wonder, was it commissioned or was it recovered? He stiffened. I don't follow. Oh, I think you do. You're restoring the portrait Gerald planned to unveil, the one that vanished before it could reveal what he discovered. But what's curious, Mr. Simmons, is why you didn't tell? The police you had it. He looked away. Because I didn't take it. No, she said gently. But someone gave it to you, didn't they? Someone you're protecting? Silence stretched between them. It was Lady Agnes, he said at last. She came to me the night before the fete. Said the portrait needed preservation, that the humidity would damage it. But she seemed frantic. I didn't ask questions. She paid well, and she told me not to tell anyone. Miss Marple's gaze rested kindly on him. Did she? Know what it showed? I think so, or feared it. Miss Marple walked home slowly, her mind swirling with impressions like leaves in a wind. Gerald had uncovered the truth. Agnes, perhaps, had tried to hide it, not to deceive, but to protect. Protect. Yet someone else had seen that portrait's truth and acted far more decisively. The poison, the inheritance, the painting threads in a larger design. But they didn't point to the same hand. No, not yet. The truth was still in motion. But Miss Marple could feel it. The twist had come, and it had shaken something loose. Now all she needed was to wait for one more secret to come tumbling out. The village of Little Whiteford, for all its charm and picturesque quiet, had become a place of unsettled hearts and whispered reckonings. The death of Gerald Greville hung in the air like the scent of dried lavender left too long in a drawer, familiar, cloying, and quietly suffocating. Yet despite the persistent buzz of speculation, Miss Marple knew that the truth would not come from conjecture or even official inquiry. It would emerge, as it always did, through the subtleties of human nature, an offhand remark, a glance, a silence too deep to ignore, and for that she needed one final push. So she invited Lady Agnes Greville to tea. She extended the invitation personally, standing at the entrance of Fernwood Hall with a small bouquet of sweet peas from her garden and a warm smile. Agnes, frailer than she had appeared in public, accepted with little ceremony. Her eyes were hollow, her manner subdued. The once proud widow who presided over the garden, fate now seemed a ghost in her own home. "I imagine," Miss Marple said gently, "you could use a quiet afternoon." Agnes nodded. "Yes, I think I could." The tea-table in Miss Marple's sitting-room was set with apple scones, lemon drizzle cake, and her prized lapsang souchong. Agnes sat on the floral settee, her back straight, hands folded in her lap. "You've been kind," Agnes said, taking a sip. "Kinder than most." Miss Marple smiled, adding a sugar cube to her tea. "We all feel the loss, my dear. Gerald was, complicated, but he was yours. And one never stops being a mother." Agnes's fingers tightened briefly on her teacup. "He had a restless mind, always questioning, always pushing, never satisfied with family stories or polite lies. It made him admirable and dangerous." "Dangerous?" Miss Marple repeated, as though the word had surprised her. Agnes looked down. "To the past, I mean. He could not leave it alone. He asked questions about Arabella. He wanted to prove that his claim to Fernwood was false. Was it?" A pause. Agnes gave the barest nod. "Yes, Arabella was not married. She was beautiful, spirited. Hector adored her and married her quietly. But he never registered the marriage officially, afraid of the scandal. Gerald, technically, had no right to inherit Fernwood. So Gerald intended to do what, exactly? Return it. Or offer it to the descendants of Hector's brother. A family in Canada, I believe?" Agnes gave a strained smile. "Imagine the horror. Canadians owning Fernwood. But that would make the missing portrait very important, wouldn't it?" Agnes didn't reply. Miss Marple set down her cup gently. "You took it the night before the fete?" "Gave it to Mr. Simmons. Why?" Agnes sighed. "Because it would have ended everything. The guests, the celebration, our life here. I hoped to delay it. Gerald was stubborn, but perhaps I thought he would listen to reason. I never imagined he'd die." "You didn't poison him," Miss Marple said calmly. Agnes flinched but shook her head. "No, but someone wanted to ensure he never spoke the truth." After Agnes left, Miss Marple took a walk through the high street, her thoughts precise, yet shrouded. She stopped by the post office and purchased a book of stamps, made light conversation at the grocer's, and then, in a casual stroke of genius, paid a visit to the Greville solicitor. Mr. Clemens was a stout, soft-spoken man with a memory like an elephant's and a manner of quiet, legal sobriety. "I wonder," she said, "if Gerald ever updated his will recently?" Mr. Clemens hesitated. "Miss Marple," she smiled, "I ask only as a curious old woman, and as someone who believes the motive for murder is never quite as complicated as people think it is often. Money, or what money represents?" Clemens studied her, then gave a slight nod. "He did," he said. 2 weeks before his death. He left Fernwood to the Canadian branch of the family if the claim was proven. Otherwise, it was to remain in his mother's care. But the more curious detail was this. He added a specific clause: any changes to the will not recognized in writing by him and 2 witnesses would be invalid. "And he left something else?" "Yes." Clemens pulled open a drawer. "A letter sealed, addressed to someone I suspect you know." He handed it over to Miss Jane Marple. "In the event of my untimely death." Miss Marple opened the letter that evening, her hand steady. "Dear Miss Marple, if this reaches you, then I have been silenced. I've come too close, and someone has acted in desperation. You, of all people, will understand the real puzzle is not the portrait nor the inheritance, but the fear beneath it. Fear of change, fear of truth, fear of exposure. I believe the portrait was hidden to delay my discovery. But I suspect someone else knew. Someone who stood to lose not Fernwood, but reputation. The poison was subtle digitalis, I believe. My wine was bitter that evening. A gift from someone who toasted me with excessive cheer, find the glass, and ask Rowena Leach why she really came back. Yours in trust, Gerald Greville. The following morning, Miss Marple invited Rowena to join her for a walk. They wandered past the old mill path, past the riverbank where wildflowers leaned with the breeze. You knew about the inheritance. Miss Marple said at last. Rowena didn't deny it. Yes, she said quietly. Gerald told me a week before he died. He was planning to give it all away. I respected him for that, even if I didn't agree. It was his decision. But you came to stop him? Rowena looked at her, then away. No, I came to say goodbye. I loved him once, but I didn't poison him, Miss Marple. You must believe me. I'm inclined to, Miss Marple said gently. But tell me, who poured Gerald's wine that day? Rowena blinked. Why, I think Lionel Simmons did. He was acting as steward for the fete. I remember Gerald complimenting him on the Riesling. Interesting, Miss Marple murmured. They turned back, their steps quiet. But in Miss Marple's mind, one moment had just clicked into place, the odd bitterness in Gerald's final drink, the eagerness with which Simmons had defended Lady Agnes, and most telling of all, the new seascape he had begun before. The fate and exact copy of the background in the missing portrait. It was time for her to lay out the final pieces. Time to gently close the circle. It was late afternoon when Miss Marple returned once more to Fernwood Hall. The sky hung low, a flat shade of pewter, and the first rumbles of a distant summer storm echoed across the downs. A fitting backdrop, she thought, for a quiet reckoning. Lady Agnes had agreed, somewhat reluctantly, to invite several key people back to Fernwood for a final gathering under the guise of sorting out Gerald's personal effects. Present were Lionel Simmons, art tutor and family companion; Rowena Leach, the one-time fiancée turned unexpected visitor; Colonel Eastgate, there as a neutral observer and justice of the peace; and of course Miss Marple herself. Agnes, draped in widow's grey, sat beside the fireplace. I still don't quite understand the purpose of this meeting, she said with forced civility. Nor I, Lionel added, his brow furrowed. It all feels rather theatrical. Perhaps, Miss Marple said gently, folding her hands in her lap. But then murder always has an element of performance, doesn't it? There was a pause. Colonel Eastgate shifted in his chair. Miss Marple smiled as though she had spoken of the weather. I have no intention of being dramatic. But I do think we're owed a little clarity, especially Gerald. She rose and crossed the room, stopping beneath the large, empty hook where Arabella Greville's portrait once hung. The absence of it was still unsettling, like a missing piece in a family tree. You see, she began, the portrait never vanished. It was hidden deliberately, not stolen. And it was done by someone who needed to prevent what Gerald was about to announce publicly. Miss Marple turned, meeting each pair of eyes in turn. Gerald had discovered that his claim to Fernwood was invalid, that his grandmother, Arabella, was never formally married to Sir Hector Greville, and therefore, by the old laws of inheritance, Fernwood should have passed to Hector's brother's descendants in Canada. Rowena gave a subtle nod. Lionel glanced down. Agnes remained still. Gerald intended to transfer the estate, perhaps not immediately, but certainly within the year. The portrait held the key to the truth. A family heirloom, yes, but also a visual signature. It included, in the corner, a date and a crest, one that confirmed Arabella's identity as a commoner and not, as family lore suggested, a daughter of minor French nobility. That contradiction would have forced a re-examination of Gerald's lineage. I told him it didn't matter, Agnes murmured. This is our home. But to someone, Miss Marple continued, it did matter. Enough to kill. She turned to Lionel Simmons. Mr. Simmons, you were unusually insistent about your whereabouts on the afternoon before the fete. You told several people you were working on a new seascape curious, since the landscape bore a remarkable resemblance to the background in the missing portrait. almost as if you were already studying it. He frowned. I was inspired by a sketch from a travel book. Unlikely, Miss Marple said, since I recognized that rocky outcrop. It's in the Arabella portrait. You copied it, which means you had access to it before it disappeared. Lionel's mouth opened, then closed. You see, she said, you were more than just Gerald's art tutor. You were, in fact, Lady Agnes's confidant, and I suspect more deeply her protector. Perhaps even unofficially her partner. Agnes gave a soft gasp, but said nothing. You feared what Gerald would do. Not because you valued the estate, but because Agnes would lose everything. Her title, her position, her standing here in Little Wychford. So you staged the disappearance of the painting, hoping to delay his announcement. And when he pressed on regardless, you acted. I didn't, Lionel began, then stopped. Miss Marple sat back down, her voice gentle but firm. Poison is a coward's weapon, Mr. Simmons, and digitalis, well, it's rare enough to draw attention. But not if one has a garden like Fernwood's. Foxglove grows rather freely, doesn't it? She turned toward Colonel Eastgate. I believe Dr. Lale confirmed traces of digitalis in the autopsy report. The colonel nodded. He did. Miss Marple's eyes returned to Lionel. You poured the wine yourself. Guests assumed it was part of your service during the fete. But Gerald mentioned to Rowena that the wine tasted bitter. He was already feeling faint before he collapsed. It was subtle, efficient. Enough, Lionel said suddenly, his voice tight. This is speculation. No, Miss Marple replied. This is observation. Gerald suspected you. He left me a letter, sealed and entrusted to his solicitor. He named you not conclusively, but with grave suspicion. She opened her handbag and drew out the folded paper, laying it delicately on the coffee table. No one reached for it. Did Agnes know? Rowena asked quietly. Miss Marple turned to her. No, of that I am certain. Lady Agnes loved her son, however difficult he may have been. But she turned a blind eye to Mr. Simmons's quiet loyalty, perhaps never questioning the lengths he might go to in her defense. Inez's face was pale. Lionel, is this true? He stared at the carpet. I wanted to spare you. Everything Gerald planned, it would have ruined you. I thought, he looked up suddenly. I thought there was no future for either of us if he carried on. But you killed my son, she said softly. You've made certain there's no future at all. There was silence. Colonel Eastgate rose slowly. Mr. Simmons, I believe we should take a walk to the constable's office. Quietly, if you please. Lionel nodded, his shoulders bowed. Miss Marple stood, smoothing the folds of her skirt. I think, she said, that Fernwood can still stand. But perhaps not as it was. Some truths, however long buried, must be aired like an old room finally opened to the sun. Later, as the summer storm broke over the village, Miss Marple returned home to her cottage. She took her tea by the window, watching raindrops race one another down the glass. Human nature, she mused, was remarkably constant. Pride and fear, love and loss all played out in endless variation, like old melodies rewritten with new harmonies. And yet, at their core, always familiar, Gerald had died not from a singular hatred, but from a misdirected loyalty. That, perhaps, was the true tragedy? She took a sip of tea, then smiled faintly. There would be no headlines, no fanfare. Only a quiet justice and the soft sound of rain falling on roses. The rain that had broken so dramatically over Little Wychford 2 evenings ago had since cleared, leaving behind a village washed clean but subdued damp hedgerows, gleaming cobbles, and a certain hush in the air. Not silence exactly, but something softer, a collective drawing of breath. Fernwood Hall had closed its gates to visitors. The curtains remained drawn, and Lady Agnes, it was said, had taken to her rooms. Only Mrs. Crouch, the long-serving housekeeper, was seen outside trimming the roses without her usual humming, eyes fixed on the petals as if willing the garden to distract her. Word of Lionel Simmons's arrest had, naturally, traveled faster than official confirmation. Little Wychford, for all its charm, had never been immune to gossip. But the tone of speculation had shifted. It was no longer excited or prurient, but pensive tinged with something close to grief. In the village shop, Mrs. Partridge said to no one in particular, "Terrible thing, really. Always so polite, Mr. Simmons, you never can tell." At the churchyard, Reverend Bell, who had known Lionel since he first arrived to teach Gerald, painting as a boy, shook his head as he arranged the Sunday service notes. He was a man of quiet duty, he said softly. Perhaps too quiet. Miss Marple, meanwhile, went about her routines with the same serene attentiveness that had always marked her presence in the village. She visited the vicarage with a cake. She took cuttings from her rose bushes to deliver to Mrs. Finch, who'd been recovering from a bout of bronchitis. And perhaps most importantly, she paid one final visit to Fernwood. Lady Agnes received her in the library. The room still smelled faintly of old tobacco and lemon oil, though no one had smoked in there since Sir Hector's day. The heavy velvet curtains remained drawn, casting the oak-paneled room in dusk-like dimness despite the midday sun. Agnes sat with her back straight, a shawl over her shoulders. A silver tea tray was untouched beside her. She looked older, far older than she had a week ago, and there was a brittleness to her manner that Miss Marple recognized all too well. The brittle strength of a woman who had lost everything she used to pretend she didn't care about. "Thank you for coming," Agnes said quietly. Miss Marple offered a gentle smile. "I thought you might prefer that I didn't, but I also thought perhaps you shouldn't be left entirely alone." "I am alone, Jane." Her voice was soft, tired, utterly. There was no attempt to hide the bitterness. Miss Marple didn't flinch. "No, you're not. You're still here. Still part of Little Whiteford. Still a woman who managed this house and its burdens with grace for more than 30 years. That doesn't disappear just because your name isn't on the deeds." Agnes gave a dry laugh. "My name never was." They sat in silence for a moment. The grandfather clock ticked gently in the corner. "I keep thinking about him," Agnes said. "Lionel, I should have seen. Something I didn't want to. He was always so considerate, so unobtrusive. I think I relied on that more than I realized." "He loved you," Miss Marple said gently. Agnes looked at her sharply. "That's hardly a comfort now." "No," Miss Marple agreed. "But perhaps in time it will help explain why." That evening, Miss Marple returned home and did something she hadn't done in years. She opened the bottom drawer of her writing desk and removed an old scrapbook. Inside were clippings, obituaries, trial reports, articles yellowed with time and memories. One page held a picture of her nephew Raymond as a boy, perched on a bicycle with one knee skinned. Another held a folded program from a parish fete. Long ago, the year Mrs. Mayhew's fruitcake had mysteriously gone missing and later reappeared in the vicar's laundry basket. A third page had the obituary of a woman Miss Marple had once helped her first case, if it could be called that. She added a new clipping, "Local artist arrested in Fernwood estate poisoning." She pasted it in carefully, smoothing the edges, then sat back and folded her hands in her lap. She had never wanted a collection of triumphs, but she had always kept records, not for pride, but for memory, for understanding. And because she had long ago decided people often forgot what they were capable of, both the good and the dark, until someone gently reminded them. The next week brought changes. Reverend Bell announced that a memorial service would be held for Gerald Greville, though the burial had already taken place in a private ceremony. Rowena Leach stayed in the village longer than anyone expected. Renting a room at the King's Arms and assisting with Fernwood's transition, Agnes slowly began to re-emerge. She attended the service in a simple black coat, no hat, no veil. She said little but greeted each guest with calm grace. When Miss Marple approached, she touched her arm. "I've been thinking," she said. "Fernwood may belong to someone else now, but I have years left in me, and I intend to make them count." Miss Marple smiled. "I never doubted that." The painting, too, was returned quietly, without ceremony. It had been discovered hidden in the loft above the summer-house, behind a panel of cedar board nailed shut with old horseshoe tacks. Lionel had concealed it before the fete, intending to retrieve it after Gerald had been silenced. The frame was intact, though a little dusty. The signature and date remained visible. Arabella's gaze, still wreathed in blue hydrangeas, now held an eerie, almost knowing expression. Rowena arranged for the painting to be sent to the Provincial Museum in Truro, where it would be displayed with a modest plaque, Arabella Greville, circa 62, artist unknown. It was Agnes who approved the loan. A Greville, she said simply, should at least be remembered. The season turned. By August's end, the last of the roses had faded. Fernwood, now under legal review, stood quiet again, but not abandoned. Miss Marple returned to her garden, trimming back the jasmine and preparing her tulip bulbs. She wrote letters. She took tea with Mrs. Crouch. She visited the new schoolmistress, recently arrived from Devonshire with a suspicious fondness for red ink and perfectly symmetrical hair buns. And on Sunday afternoons she walked. Not to search, not to deduce, but to breathe. Along the river path, past the old mill, through the rows of sweet peas and lupins that Gerald had once photographed obsessively, looking for the perfect angle. He never found it, she remembered. But that had never stopped him from trying. As she paused beneath the willow tree by the footbridge, Miss Marple turned her face to the sun. The truth, she knew, was not always comforting, but it was necessary, like pruning, like harvesting, like letting go, and in the quiet aftermath, there was space finally for something to grow again. 2 weeks after the arrest, little Wychford had resumed its rhythm. The markets reopened, the children returned to the green with cricket bats and grass-stained knees, and the shop windows began displaying early autumn wears wool scarves, blackberry preserves, and jars of elderflower cordial with handwritten labels, yet beneath the surface the village had subtly changed. There were fewer raised voices in the King's Arms parlor, fewer jokes made at the expense of Gerald Greville's modern art exhibitions, and far fewer comments passed about Lady Agnes in the butcher's queue. It was as though the village, long content to amuse itself with idle cruelty, had peered into a mirror it did not like and had found itself obliged, however reluctantly, to adjust its reflection. Miss Marple noticed this, though she said nothing of it. She, too, had resumed her routines tending the perennial border, writing long letters to her nephew Raymond in St. Mary Mead, and preparing for the Harvest Festival, which was being organized this year by a nervous Mrs. Carmichael, who insisted on pairing purple asters with orange marigolds. But one matter still tugged at Miss Marple's mind like a loose thread in a well-mended jumper. She had not yet spoken to Lionel Simmons, and she intended to. It was Inspector Greaves who arranged the visit, though with evident reluctance. He met her outside the Wychford holding station, a temporary structure used mainly for drunks and minor offenses. Lionel had been kept there until his transfer to the Chelmsford Assizes. "You know," Greaves said, adjusting the cuffs of his jacket, "I never could make heads or tails of that fellow. Polite, well-read, quiet as a mouse, but I've spoken to men like him before. When they finally snap, it's always clean. Clinical, efficient." Miss Marple tilted her head. "And yet this murder was none of those things." Greaves gave her a sidelong glance. "You think we got the wrong man?" "No," she said softly. "I think you got the right one. I only wonder whether you truly understood him." They entered the narrow corridor, the walls pale green, the floor worn linoleum. A constable led her to a small room with a pane of glass and 2 metal chairs. Lionel sat on the far side. He looked older. Not broken, there was too much steel in him for that, but worn down, as though something had eroded his edges. He looked up when she entered. "Miss Marple," she nodded. "Mr. Simmons." For a moment neither spoke. Then Miss Marple folded her gloved hands on the table. "I thought," she said gently, "you might prefer a conversation that wasn't procedural." He gave a short, dry laugh. "Pity I didn't kill Gerald in a more fashionable way. It would have made for better conversation." "Poison is an old method," she said. "Not fashionable, perhaps, but very traditional, especially among those who value silence." Lionel looked at her for a long moment, then said, "You already know, don't you?" "I do," he sighed. "I suppose you want to know why?" "No, she said. I already know that too. She leaned forward slightly. What? I would like to know is whether it brought you peace. Lionel looked away. His shoulders hunched, then lifted, then fell. No, he said, not really. Outside, the sun had slipped behind a stretch of cloud. A light wind had picked up, scattering leaves across the road like confetti from a forgotten wedding. Miss Marple walked slowly along the village green, passing the post office, the pub, and the bakery. She paused outside the former schoolhouse, now converted into a modest art center, where a new instructor had been hired, a woman from Devon with a fondness for charcoal studies and large earrings. A painting had been placed in the window. It was a portrait of a child with wind-blown hair and eyes too large for her face. The brushstrokes were tentative, the perspective slightly off. But there was something honest in it, something searching. Miss Marple smiled faintly. That evening she hosted tea for a few old friends, Mrs. Hardcastle, Reverend Bell, and a pale but resolute Agnes Greville, who had not been to the Marple cottage in nearly 3 years. They sat around the fire, sipping tea and nibbling seed cake. Talk meandered from the harvest festival to the new organist to the regrettable color scheme chosen for the parish reading room. Eventually the topic turned to Fernwood and Gerald. It seems strange now, Agnes murmured. So much anger, so many secrets. All those years spent preserving something already broken. Miss Marple, who had been darning a small tear in her knitting basket, looked up. Preservation, she said mildly, is not always the same as healing. One must let the wound close, but some keep picking at it. Reverend Bell nodded. In Scripture there's a passage about hidden sins festering like wounds beneath the skin. Mrs. Hardcastle blinked. Very poetic, Vicar. Agnes, unusually quiet, set down her cup. Do you believe people can change? She asked. Suddenly, truly, after doing something unforgivable? There was a beat of silence. Then Miss Marple said, I believe that people can understand themselves better. Whether they change depends on what they do with that understanding. Agnes looked into the fire. That seems fair. Later, when the guests had gone and the embers were low, Miss Marple sat alone with her knitting. The house was quiet, save for the faint tick of the mantel clock and the occasional sigh of wind through the chimney. The case had, in a sense, concluded. Lionel had confessed eventually. The poison had been traced to a rare South American extract, one that had, curiously, been mentioned in a book on Victorian botanical remedies which Lionel had borrowed from the Fernwood Library a year prior. He had placed the poison in Gerald's flask the morning of the fete, certain that no one would notice, least of all Gerald, whose routine never varied, and no one had noticed. Except Miss Marple. Not because of the poison or the flask or even the missing portrait, but because, as she had observed long ago, people rarely change their true selves, but they do, occasionally, let the mask slip. She had seen it in Gerald's dismissive contempt, in Agnes's weary silence, in Lionel's careful stillness. And when she had seen Lionel watching the crowd with that peculiar expression, not guilt, not anxiety, but resolution, she had known, but that was done now. Outside, the moon had risen. The hydrangeas in the garden swayed gently. A moth beat its wings against the window pane. Miss Marple set aside her knitting, rose, and walked to the bureau. From the bottom drawer, she withdrew her scrapbook once more. She opened to a fresh page. A new clipping modest, tucked near the bottom of the page. Village poisoning. Artist confesses in quiet case that shocked Fernwood. She smoothed the edges, folded the paper, and placed it beside the others. Then she picked up her teacup, took a sip, and smiled faintly to herself. Some mysteries, she knew, did not end with a gavel or a verdict. Some ended in silence. And sometimes that was justice enough. The gentle warmth of an early autumn afternoon filtered through the lace curtains of Miss Marple's sitting room as she sat quietly sewing a hem on one of her many handkerchiefs. Outside, the soft hum of village life was a pleasant backdrop. Children's laughter drifting from the green, the distant clink of the blacksmith's hammer, and the rustling of leaves in the garden. It was a day that might have passed unnoticed had it not been for the knock at the door. Miss Marple rose with her usual composed grace and opened it to find a figure she had not expected, Dr. Lyle, the village physician. "Good afternoon." "Dr. Lyle," she said, stepping aside to allow him entrance. "What brings you here so unexpectedly?" He offered a thin smile, but his eyes were clouded with concern. "Miss Marple, I hope I'm not intruding. I've come with a request, though I'm not sure I can quite explain it myself." Curiosity piqued, Miss Marple gestured to a chair near the window. "Do sit, and do tell." Settling himself, Dr. Lyle took a deep breath. "It's about Lionel Simmons. Since his arrest, I found myself troubled by certain inconsistencies in the medical reports, details overlooked or perhaps misunderstood." Miss Marple folded her hands, attentive. "Please go on." "Well," he began, the digitalis. "Poisoning was confirmed, of course. But the levels present in Gerald's system were oddly low for a fatal dose, especially given the time elapsed. It led me to wonder if something else was at play, something that might have weakened him beforehand, or made him more susceptible." Miss Marple nodded slowly, her mind already turning over possibilities. "An underlying condition, perhaps?" Dr. Lyle hesitated. "Exactly. Something subtle, not obvious in the first examination, and there's more. Gerald's symptoms. Before collapse, dizziness, blurred vision could have been caused by other factors, including psychological stress." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Stress, the invisible culprit in many mysteries." He looked relieved at her understanding. "I'm not a detective, but I wondered if you might be willing to assist me in reviewing some of Gerald's recent history, particularly anything that might have affected his health or well-being in unexpected ways." "Of course, Dr. Lyle, I shall be happy to help." Over the following days, Miss Marple and Dr. Lyle exchanged notes and observations. She revisited her conversations with villagers and reviewed her own memories, while he provided medical context and quietly shared his concerns. Together, they uncovered small but telling clues. Gerald's letters had become increasingly erratic, his handwriting shaky. Neighbors had noticed his pale complexion and frequent headaches. Most telling, his diary contained a single cryptic entry written in shaky script on the morning before the fete, "Too tired to fight. Something else is wearing me down." Miss Marple's sharp eyes caught a pattern she had missed before. "This wasn't just a murder, Doctor. It was a slow unraveling, a series of blows that left Gerald vulnerable to a final, fatal strike." Dr. Lyle nodded gravely. "Yes, and I suspect the true villain may not be the one we all thought." The news unsettled the village. When Miss Marple shared her findings discreetly with Inspector Greaves, the officer furrowed his brow. "Are you suggesting there was an accomplice?" "Perhaps," Miss Marple replied softly. "Or at least someone who contributed to Gerald's decline in ways less visible than poison." Greaves was silent for a long moment before asking, "Who?" "That is what we must discover." Miss Marple's next step was a careful revisit to those closest to Gerald in his final days. She began with Rowena Leach, who had remained in the village, offering aid with the estate's transition. Rowena was hesitant at first, but her trust in Miss Marple's gentle manner won through. "There were moments," Rowena confided, "when Gerald seemed frightened, not of me, but of something else. I thought it was the stress of the estate and his mother's opposition, but now I wonder if it was more." Miss Marple encouraged her gently. "Did he ever mention anyone who troubled him personally?" "Someone who might have wished him ill before the poison?" Rowena shook her head. "No names. But he was cautious, secretive, even especially after Lionel arrived." The mention of Lionel caused a flicker in her eyes. "I never believed Lionel was capable of murder. Jane, something was off. There was a tension between them that went beyond art or family." Next, Miss Marple sought out Lady Agnes, whose grief and guilt seemed to have softened into a tentative acceptance. Agnes, surprisingly candid, admitted to a long-held suspicion. "I never trusted Dr. Lyle's bedside manner. He's too calm, too detached. I felt perhaps unfairly that he withheld things from us, from Gerald." Miss Marple raised an eyebrow. "Do you think Dr. Lyle might have had a hand in this?" Agnes hesitated, then said quietly, "I don't know. But I intend to find out." As the days wore on, Miss Marple's quiet inquiries began to weave a new web of suspicion. Dr. Lyle's medical Notes suggested a troubling pattern. Several patients with minor ailments had been prescribed digitalis or similar cardiac drugs recently, often without clear necessity. Meanwhile, a local nurse confided that she'd seen Dr. Lale quietly discard vials of medication and refused to discuss his actions with colleagues. Miss Marple realized she was confronting a very different kind of danger, a measured, cold threat, hidden beneath the reassuring veneer of medical expertise. One crisp evening, as twilight painted the sky in shades of lilac and rose, Miss Marple sat once more in her armchair, musing on the tangled threads. A knock at the door startled her. Opening it, she found Inspector Greaves standing there, looking grave. "We need to speak," he said. In the parlor, Greaves laid out new evidence. A witness who had seen Dr. Lyle near Fernwood the day before the fete, acting nervously and carrying a small parcel. The witness's description was clear and unambiguous. Miss Marple smiled faintly. It seems the portrait's disappearance was only the beginning. The following day, Dr. Lyle was confronted by Inspector Greaves and, after an initial denial, confessed to having tampered with Gerald's medications in an attempt to hasten his demise. Motive: a mixture of professional jealousy and a twisted sense of mercy born of long-suppressed grudges. Miss Marple's quiet brilliance had unraveled the final piece, not just the overt act of murder, but the covert erosion that made it possible. As little Wychford absorbed this latest shock, Miss Marple reflected once more on the complexity of human nature. People were often more than one thing, capable of kindness and cruelty, love and hate, all tangled in a single heart. And justice, she mused, was not always swift. Sometimes it was the slow unfolding of truth, revealed not by force but by patient observation and gentle persistence. She settled back with her sewing, the village dusk settling softly around her. The mystery was nearly closed. Only the last chapter remained. The first chill of early autumn was beginning to creep through the air as Miss Marple arranged her familiar teacups on the low table by the window. Outside, the last leaves of the season fluttered, pale gold and russet, while a restless wind whispered through the hedgerows. Her small sitting room was filled with the muted light of late afternoon, the gentle tick of the mantel clock providing a steady rhythm as she prepared for her final, delicate maneuver. Though the village believed the mystery solved, with Lionel Simmons and Dr. Lyle both in custody, Miss Marple had yet to feel the full closure that only comes with certainty. Something still unsettled her, a subtle discord in the tapestry of truths she had carefully woven. Her suspicions, as always, were not drawn from bold evidence, but from the quiet signals given off by human nature itself. She had arranged to meet Rowena Leach that afternoon. The young woman had remained in Little Wychford, working to steady herself amidst the upheaval. Miss Marple found her waiting in the village tea-room, a book resting on the table but largely ignored. "Rowena," Miss Marple greeted warmly, settling into the chair opposite. "I hope you don't mind my dropping by." Rowena smiled faintly, her eyes betraying fatigue. "Not at all, Miss Marple. I'm glad to see you." Miss Marple began. Gently, "I wanted to talk about Gerald." Rowena's gaze flickered downward, then back up. "There's not much more to say, is there?" "Perhaps not," Miss Marple replied, "but I have always found that sometimes the smallest detail can change the whole picture." Rowena raised an eyebrow. "I suppose I'm afraid of what that might mean." "Fear is a powerful thing," Miss Marple said quietly, "but it can also be revealing." Their conversation drifted to memories of Gerald, his temper, his insecurities, and the unexpected tenderness that only a few knew. Yet, as Miss Marple listened, she noticed Rowena's eyes often darted toward the door, a subtle unease beneath her composed manner. Carefully, Miss Marple changed the subject. "Rowena, did Gerald ever mention anyone else who might have resented him? Someone beyond Lionel or Dr. Lyle?" Rowena hesitated. "There was one person someone Gerald trusted but who disappointed him deeply." Miss Marple's fingers tightened around her teacup. "Who might that be?" Rowena's voice was low. "His mother." The room seemed to shrink around them. Miss Marple felt the weight of the unspoken truth settle between them. "Lady Agnes?" she asked softly. Yes, Rowena said. Gerald was torn between his love for her and his frustration with her refusal to accept the changes he wanted. He confided that she could be cold, calculating even. Miss Marple nodded slowly. It is often the closest relationships that carry the deepest conflicts. Rowena swallowed hard. He mentioned once that he feared she might go to any lengths to preserve the family's reputation, even if it meant hurting him. A sudden understanding dawned in Miss Marple's mind. The motive she had considered protecting the estate, silencing Gerald, might run deeper still, threaded through years of quiet tension. Determined to test her theory, Miss Marple arranged a meeting with Lady Agnes under the pretense of discussing arrangements for the forthcoming Harvest Festival. Agnes greeted her in the dim, oak-paneled library, her eyes shadowed but alert. "Jane," she said, using the name they shared in their private moments, "to what do I owe this visit?" Miss Marple smiled gently. "I thought it best we speak frankly, as two women who know the weight of family." Agnes's gaze hardened just slightly, but she nodded. "I have been thinking," Miss Marple began, "about how much was hidden beneath the surface at Fernwood. About how sometimes the desire to protect can blind us to the cost." Agnes's hands clenched briefly. "I did what I thought was right." "Of course," Miss Marple said. "But sometimes what we think is right is not the whole truth." She leaned forward slightly. "Lady Agnes, did you ever fear Gerald's plans? Did you worry they would undo everything your family had built?" Agnes's voice was steady but guarded. "Yes, but I never wanted him harmed." "And yet," Miss Marple said softly, "harm came." A long pause stretched between them. "Jane," Agnes said finally, "I did what I had to for Fernwood. I will not apologize for protecting what was entrusted to me." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled faintly. "No apologies needed, Lady Agnes, but I wonder, did you act alone, or did you have help?" Agnes's eyes flickered, a subtle sign Miss Marple had learned to watch for. "I had allies," Agnes admitted quietly. "Men and women who feared change as much as I did." "And Lionel Simmons?" A faint flush crept over Agnes's cheeks. "He was loyal. More than that, sometimes dangerously so. And Dr. Lyle?" "His loyalties are his own," Agnes said with a sharpness that betrayed more than she intended. Miss Marple rose slowly. "Thank you for your honesty, Agnes. I believe we are close to understanding the full story." As she prepared to leave, Agnes took her hand. "Jane, sometimes knowing the truth is its own burden." Miss Marple squeezed her hand gently. "The truth is a burden we all must bear. All must bear." That evening, back in her quiet cottage, Miss Marple sat at her desk, pen in hand. The pieces were falling into place, relationships, resentments, and loyalties entwined in a web far more intricate than anyone had suspected. She thought of Gerald, caught between love and betrayal. Of Agnes, determined to hold on to a fading legacy. Of Lionel, whose devotion turned deadly. And of Dr. Lyle, whose calm exterior masked darker impulses. But the final test, she knew, awaited one last player. The game was almost over. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the village green, dappling the worn stone benches and flickering through the branches of the ancient oaks that lined the path. Miss Marple, serene as ever, paced slowly beneath their boughs, her hands clasped behind her back. Her keen eyes took in every subtle movement, the glance shared between neighbors, the quickened pace of a young woman, the slight hesitation before a door was closed. The time had come to set her final test. That evening, Miss Marple invited Lady Agnes Greville to tea at her cottage. The invitation was worded simply and without fanfare, but the significance was clear to both women. Agnes arrived promptly, her face composed but with a flicker of uncertainty in her eyes. The tension between them was tangible, softened only by the comforting scent of freshly brewed Earl Grey and the delicate porcelain cups that clinked softly on the lace cloth. They exchanged civilities, spoke briefly of the changing season and the village's preparations for the harvest festival, but beneath the surface, a game was unfolding. Miss Marple sipped her tea, then remarked casually, "You know, Agnes, I've often found that the most revealing conversations occur over something as simple as tea." Agnes smiled, but it did not reach her eyes. "Indeed, Jane, and I am quite willing to share mine, if it will bring any comfort." Miss Marple's gaze sharpened slightly. "Comfort is a rare thing after recent events. More often we seek understanding." Agnes inclined her head. "Then I shall be honest with you. Whatever you think of me, know this: I never wished harm upon my son." "Nor did I," Miss Marple said softly. "But there are those who believe intentions alone cannot absolve consequences." The conversation drifted, weaving between careful statements and loaded silences. Miss Marple watched Agnes closely, noting the subtle shifts, the brief tightening of her fingers around the teacup, the faint tremor in her voice when speaking of Gerald's ambitions, the way her eyes flicked towards the portrait hung on the wall. "Do you remember," Miss Marple asked casually, "the day of the garden fete, the moment the portrait vanished?" Agnes stiffened imperceptibly. Of course, it was a shock to us all. But it was not a theft in the usual sense. "Was it?" Miss Marple pressed gently. "More a hiding, perhaps? A secret kept for reasons no one could guess at?" Agnes's lips pressed thin. "Yes, a secret." Miss Marple allowed the silence to linger before continuing. "And secrets have a way of revealing themselves, sometimes in the most unexpected ways." Agnes shifted in her seat, a faint flush coloring her cheeks. "Jane, I do not understand where you are leading." Miss Marple leaned forward slightly, her tone soft but firm. "I am reminded of an old proverb: the devil is in the details." "And the details," Agnes suggests, that the disappearance of the portrait was a distraction. Agnes blinked, her composure slipping for a moment. "A distraction?" "Yes," Miss Marple replied. While the village's attention was focused on the missing painting, something far graver was unfolding. A quiet, deliberate Act I designed to silence Gerald before he could reveal truths inconvenient to some. The older woman's breath caught. "You are suggesting—" "I am suggesting that the plan involved more than one player. That loyalty, fear, and ambition intertwined to produce a tragedy." Agnes's expression hardened, but her voice was steady. "I admit that I acted to protect my family. But I am not a murderer." Miss Marple smiled kindly. "Nor do I believe you are, Agnes, but perhaps you were too trusting of those around you." A long pause followed. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, Agnes said, "There is someone you have not considered." Miss Marple's interest piqued. "And who might that be?" Agnes glanced toward the window, her eyes distant. "Rowena." The name hung between them, weighty and unexpected. Miss Marple's mind raced. Rowena Leach, the young woman who had appeared so fragile, yet had been present at every pivotal moment. Agnes continued. "She was closer to Gerald than anyone realized. She knew of his plans, his fears. And perhaps she feared the consequences more than we did." Miss Marple folded her hands calmly. "Do you believe she had a motive?" Agnes nodded slowly. "Yes, not just for love or jealousy, but for something deeper, something that threatened her own future." The next afternoon, Miss Marple arranged to meet Rowena again, this time in the privacy of the village library. As they sat among shelves heavy with leather-bound volumes, Miss Marple's questions were gentle but probing. "Rowena, I have been thinking about loyalty, about the lengths we go to protect those we care for." Rowena's hands trembled slightly as she clasped her book tighter. "I did care for Gerald." "And did you fear the changes he proposed?" Miss Marple asked softly. "The upheaval they might bring?" Rowena nodded. "Yes, I feared losing everything I had come to hope for." Miss Marple watched her closely. "And did you ever feel alone in that fear?" Rowena's eyes glistened. "Sometimes." It was then that Miss Marple posed her subtle test. She mentioned, almost in passing, a detail she had never shared before about the horseshoe tacks used to conceal the portrait in the summer-house loft. Rowena's face betrayed the slightest flicker of recognition, a quick intake of breath that Miss Marple had learned to trust as a sign of hidden knowledge. "Tell me, Rowena," she said quietly, "did you ever handle those tacks? Did you know the summer-house well?" Rowena's composure cracked for a fraction of a second. "Yes," she admitted. "I was there that morning." Miss Marple nodded. "And did you move the portrait yourself?" The young woman's eyes filled with tears. I wanted to protect Gerald. I thought hiding the portrait would buy us time to keep secrets safe, to prevent more harm. But in doing so, Miss Marple said softly, you became part of the chain that led to tragedy. Rowena looked down, ashamed but relieved. I never wanted this. Later that evening, Miss Marple sat quietly in her chair, the last light fading from the sky outside. The truth had come slowly but surely, a layered tale of fear, protection, and misplaced loyalty. The village of Little Whiteford would awaken tomorrow to a new clarity, but also to a new sorrow. For the vanishing portrait had hidden more than paint and canvas. It had concealed fractured hearts and secrets that had only just begun to surface. Miss Marple sipped her tea and smiled faintly to herself. The final act was near. The village hall was hushed, the usual warmth of the room replaced by a chill of expectation. The harvest festival had drawn most of Little Whiteford's inhabitants. Eager to put aside recent troubles for a time, yet an unspoken tension lingered, as though the community waited for something or someone to break the silence that had settled like a fog. Miss Marple stood near the back, hands folded calmly, her sharp eyes taking in the gathered faces. Lady Agnes, pale but resolute. Rowena, quietly nervous. Inspector Greaves, his brows drawn in concentration, and a scattering of other villagers, each carrying their own secrets and suspicions. It was here, amidst familiar faces and under the soft glow of gas lamps, that Miss Marple chose to untangle the last threads of a mystery that had gripped the village for months. My friends, she began, her voice steady but gentle, this has been a troubling time for us all. The disappearance of the portrait, the death of Mr. Greville, and the ensuing accusations have shaken the foundations of our peaceful village. But I believe it is time to look beyond surface appearances, to examine the hearts and motives that brought us here. A murmur rippled through the crowd, but Miss Marple raised her hand, silencing them. Let us consider the portrait itself, she said. An object of beauty, yes, but also a symbol of pride, legacy, and perhaps most importantly, secrets. She paused, glancing toward Lady Agnes, whose expression remained inscrutable. The portrait's disappearance was no accident, nor was it mere theft. It was an act intended to distract us, to divert attention while darker deeds unfolded in the shadows. Miss Marple's gaze swept the room, finally resting on Rowena. Miss Leach, she continued, you played a part in this. You moved the portrait not out of malice, but out of fear for those you cared about, and a desperate hope to delay the inevitable. Rowena's face flushed, but she met Miss Marple's eyes with a mixture of guilt and relief. That act, though well-intentioned, set in motion a series of events no one foresaw. Turning now to Inspector Greaves, Miss Marple spoke quietly. You arrested Mr. Simmons. Believing him the perpetrator, and rightly so, he administered the poison that ended Mr. Greville's life. Yet as we have learned, poison was not the whole story. She glanced toward Dr. Lyle, absent but not forgotten. Dr. Lyle's tampering with Mr. Greville's medications weakened him, making the final blow possible. His motives were twisted, a blend of jealousy and cold calculation. A collective gasp spread through the hall. Miss Marple's eyes then shifted to Lady Agnes. Lady Agnes, your desire to protect the family legacy was strong, but it was the alliances you fostered, the loyalties you called upon, that created the environment in which such tragedies could occur. Inez's lips pressed into a thin line, but she said nothing. Miss Marple took a breath, then lowered her voice to a confidential murmur, audible only to those closest. But there is one last truth that must be told. A hush fell deeper. The person who most feared change, who most desperately sought control, and who most cleverly concealed their hand in this tragedy was none other than— She turned slowly toward the back, where a figure stood. Rowena stepped forward, eyes shining with tears. It was I, Rowena confessed, voice trembling but steady. I feared losing Gerald, feared losing the future he promised. I hid the portrait to protect him, but I also feared the change he represented. When I saw the growing rift between him and his mother, between him and Lionel, I panicked. The room was silent, the weight of her words settling like a stone. I did not intend to kill Gerald. But I failed him by hiding the truth, by letting fear dictate my actions. The poison, the tampering, those were others' doing, but I share responsibility for the events my choices set in motion. Miss Marple stepped forward, her expression compassionate yet firm. Fear is a powerful motivator, she said, and it often leads us to choices we regret. But it is the courage to face those choices, to accept responsibility that defines us. Rowena nodded, tears spilling freely. Lady Agnes moved to her side, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. Perhaps in facing this truth we can find some measure of peace. As the crowd began to stir, the inspector stepped forward to speak of next steps, the legal processes that would follow, and the importance of healing as a community. Miss Marple lingered a moment longer, her eyes catching the faint glimmer of the now-returned portrait, carefully restored and hung once again. In Fernwood's drawing room, the child in the painting, her eyes large and searching, seemed almost to smile in the flickering candlelight. Later that evening, as the village slowly emptied and the stars took their places in the sky, Miss Marple sat alone in her cozy cottage, a cup of tea warming her hands. She thought of the tangled lives, the secrets unearthed, and the delicate balance between justice and mercy. Some wounds would heal with time, others would leave scars. But through it all, the truth had found its way to the surface, not with noise or fury, but with quiet patience and observation. And that, Miss Marple knew, was the true art of detection. The end.